Abraham, is he father of just the Jews, or is he father of us all? Today, I want to tell you exactly who Abraham is and how you're related to him. Are you ready? It's time to encounter the Hebrew Scriptures. So picking up from last week, Noah and his descendants come off the ark. The corrupted seed of half angelic, half human beings are completely wiped out. And the children of Noah are reproducing, remultiplying, and eventually each one of these tribes are scattered throughout the earth by God after they attempted to build the Tower of Babel. And directly after, Genesis chapter 11 redirects our attention to the genealogy of Shem, who is one of the sons of Noah. And out of his bloodline, we see no other than Abraham, who at the time, his name is called Abram. And as the story goes, God calls Abram out of his father's house to journey to a land where we see Abraham, whose name will be changed from Abram to Abraham, receive a promise from God. And later down the road, I'll do more in-depth teaching on Abraham, such as showing you guys the importance of his encounter with Melchizedek and his journey to Egypt and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But today, I really want to focus on two major themes in the story. One being the significance of the promise from God, and secondly, a surprisingly interesting detail about his wife Sarah that gives us insight into what I've said time after time after time after time, who the scriptures are all about. And if you've been watching, you'll know exactly who I'm talking about. And I'll give you a hint. His name starts with Jesus and ends with Christ. So I hope you can figure that out. Now, last video, I went into detail about the transformation of the human race at the cross from the seed of Adam to the seed of God. So why did the seed of God replace the seed of Adam? Because it was a part of the plan of God that was thought out before he created the cosmos. His plan was to finish his creation by becoming a part of it. So how did he do it then? Well, I'm sure we all know how human beings are brought into the world. A seed, an egg. You see where I'm getting at? So, using the same logic, how do you think God got himself into the planet? Well, by a seed and an egg. Seed of righteousness conceived through a virgin birth. So, we see that Jesus was brought into the world by the seed. And we'll see here in Genesis chapter 15 how the seed was promised to Abraham. Genesis 15 verse 5. And he brought forth abroad and said, Look now towards heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. Verse 6. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. All right, now I want you to pay close attention to what I'm about to say. Abraham believed, and God counted it to him for righteousness. It did not say Abraham believed and God made him righteous. So what's the difference between being made righteous and having righteousness counted to you, or a term we would say is having imputed righteousness? Well, I want you to imagine this. Imagine imputed righteousness as God basically writing out a will to Abraham and saying that all his possessions that God has is going to be credited to your seed. And your seed is going to be the recipient of the righteousness that will be later manifested at the cross. So, with that understanding, the seed of Abraham, as we know, is actually the seed of God. So, we can conclude that Abraham, or any part of Adam's seed, could not manifest the promise of righteousness by believing. Well, why can't a man's belief make him righteous? Didn't God give the law to the Jews as a spirituality to attempt to become righteous? Well, yes, he did. But the temple sacrifices and ceremonies only covered the sins of the people. That's why they had to perform the cleansing rituals over and over, year after year after year, because they were still a part of the seed of Adam, which was under the curse of sin. from the Garden of Eden. So if man's belief is incapable of resolving the issue of sin, then the only person who had the power to end sin had to be the person who implemented it in the first place. How did God do it? He had to disrupt the seed. The seed from Abraham to Christ was broken at the conception of Christ. Christ had to be born of the seed of righteousness of God and not the seed of the sin of Adam. So Christ, being the only person born of the righteous seed of God, qualified him as the only candidate having the ability to do away with sin and make everyone righteous. So how is Christ, who is from a different seed, able to bring everyone into the promise of righteousness? Because Christ is of Abraham's seed, who was born out of the bloodline from Abraham that was passed down all the way to the Virgin Mary. And Christ is also the seed of God because he was conceived of the Spirit. Wait a second. Isn't Abraham the father of the Jewish people? Wouldn't the promise concerning Abraham's seed make only Jewish people righteous? Well, the Apostle Paul answers this question for us in his teaching about the promise in Romans chapter 4, starting at verse 10. How was it then reckoned? When he was in circumcision or in uncircumcision? Not in circumcision, but in uncircumcision. And he received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness of faith, which he had yet being uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed unto them also, and the father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham, which he had being yet uncircumcised. Very clearly, we see that the promise benefits not only the Jew, but also the Gentile. Why? Because Abraham received the promise while he was uncircumcised. So the promise benefited the Gentile because of uncircumcision, and the promise benefited the Jew because of circumcision. And the circumcision that the Jews followed was the seal of the righteousness of faith. Well, whose faith? Abraham's faith? The Jews' faith? Well, neither. It was by God's faith. God's faith is the faith that created the universe and the faith that manifested the promise of righteousness. As I mentioned earlier, it was impossible for man's belief to manifest the righteousness of God because man was made in the image of God and came from the seed of Adam. So, likewise, it would also be impossible for a man created by God, subject to sin, to manifest the righteousness of God by personal faith. If man possessed this kind of faith, the story in Genesis would read, in the beginning, man created the heavens and the earth, which doesn't really make that much sense at all. And the Apostle Paul gives us a clear explanation of whose faith manifested the promise of righteousness in verse 13. For the promise that he should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. Therefore, it is of faith that it might be by grace, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made thee a father of many nations, before him who he believed, even God, who quickeneth the dead, and calleth those things which be not as though they were, who against hope believed in hope, that he might become the father of many nations, according to that which was spoken, so shall thy seed be. All right, very clearly in verse 17, Paul shows us that God's faith is what set all this into motion. The faith of God, which implemented the promise of righteousness, is the faith that quickened or made alive the dead, and called those things which be not as though they were. And there's a teaching that going around saying that, many faith teachers, they like to say that you can use your faith and make those things which are not as though they were. Such as using your faith to manifest money or health or, the love of your life, whatever it might be. That's not what Paul's talking about here. It's not talking about your personal faith making those things which be not as though they were. Paul is saying the death and resurrection of Christ, or Christ being quickened from the dead, was planned out before creation. All those things that God made which be not as though they were all planned out before creation. So the promise of righteousness being a result of the resurrection also had been planned out before creation, because everything that is eternal had to have began before time began. Hey guys, before I go, I left out one detail about Sarah that I said I was going to talk about in the video, and I forgot to. So here it is. Sarah's womb is a type and shadow of the tomb of Christ, because we see in Genesis that Sarah's womb was dead, and we know that Christ died and went into the tomb. So we can see by comparison that the seed came out of Sarah's womb, which was the seed that was going to inherit the promise, and the seed that was the promise came out of the tomb, which was at the resurrection of Christ. So I just wanted to share that little detail that I forgot. Eventually I'll have to do a part 2 to this, because there's just so many details in Genesis that I just didn't even have time to discuss that are very important to understanding the story. And I recommend you please go read Genesis in context, and remember that everything we teach here is based in the scriptures, and we just allow the Holy Spirit to show us what that has to do with the finished work of the cross. And I hope that I shared something new and gave you a new perspective to think about. Again, if you have any questions or insults or comments, concerns, let me know down in the link below, and I'll see you guys next time.